Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, the international community speaking out against the Taliban's brutal actions since their swift takeover in Afghanistan as the U.S. withdrew from the country. Fox News foreign correspondent Trey Yingst reflects on his time in Afghanistan before, during, and after the Afghan government's collapse and his experiences interacting with members of the Taliban. And across the nation, housing prices continue to rise. Real estate agent and co-host of the hit HGTV show Love It or List It, David Visentin sheds light on the state of the housing market and how the pandemic and the supply chain are impacting the cost of homes and renovations. Plus commentary by Fox News contributor and author Mollie Hemingway. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Brett Baer.
I'm Maria Bartiromo.
I'm Brian Kilmeade, and this is the Fox News Rundown. Friday, October 15th, 2021. I'm Chris Foster. As a Fox News foreign correspondent in Afghanistan, Trey Yingst has gotten to know the Taliban a lot more than most Americans.
The unit that these fighters came from was a suicide bomb unit. So most of the guys running security at our hotel had signed up to be suicide bombers, or they were roadside bomb makers. And now they were the people that you literally saw in line at the breakfast buffet.
I'm Jessica Rosenthal. The real estate market's been on fire, so have home renovations. Is it all COVID related, and will it stay hot or cool off soon?
I don't think it's going to dial back all that much. You know, I think people are always going to want housing. It's just, I don't see it changing.
And I'm Mollie Hemingway. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Trey Yingst has been covering war zones since college, reporting on fighting between Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza. He came to work for Fox News Channel as a foreign correspondent 3 years ago based in Jerusalem and has been widely praised for his coverage in Afghanistan before, during, and since the Taliban's takeover of the country and American troop withdrawal.
We've just arrived in Kabul, Afghanistan, where evacuations are continuing at this hour. There are a number of people outside of this hotel in Kabul who worked for the Americans at the U.S. Embassy, and they're left behind.
Civilians outside of Kabul grab for food as a car with aid workers inside drives by. Here at a children's hospital in the Afghan capital of Kabul, kids are being treated for malnutrition. Just last month, 5 died here, waiting for international aid to arrive. This commander from Logar province was in charge of a unit that included suicide bombers, roadside bomb makers, and combat fighters. He says the Taliban fought too hard not to have their laws put into practice. As we speak with this young law student at Kabul University, a Taliban fighter shows up with a weapon in hand, intimidating her, forcing us to abruptly end the interview.
He spent a lot of time speaking with Taliban leaders, spokespeople, and fighters.
While you have to remember who these people are, you also have to remember that in order to have access to the group, you need to communicate with them. And I think that that's an important aspect of this story.
Trey's been back home in Pennsylvania for a bit before getting back to work in Jerusalem. He's also the host of the Fox News Rundown Evening Edition.
Communicating with people around the world, good guys, bad guys, and everyone in between, to let them know what our role as journalists is. Our role is not to help them or to make them look good, but it's also not to make them look bad. It's to report exactly what they do. And I'm always very clear with the group when we have these conversations behind the scenes. Look, we are going to report what you do. And if that involves cutting a peace deal, we will report that to the world. But if it involves killing civilians, we're going to report that too.
Yeah, I mean, you said good guys and bad guys. Nobody's the bad guy in their own story, right? I mean, terrorists don't see themselves as terrorists. They see themselves as, fighting honorably for some cause. Now, what is the cause for these guys? Is it religious purity? Is it power? Is it money? Or just it depends on who you ask?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely based on religion and land. And you make a great point that they don't see themselves as the bad guys. People who signed up to be suicide bombers, they believe they're doing the right thing and that they're following the religious education that they received and that this is ultimately what their purpose on earth is. So it can be very interesting talking to them because there's no sort of Western sense of normalcy when it comes to what Americans should be able to do and where they should be able to operate. I think that it's very interesting when you talk to them because they say they're fighting a a war, an unconventional war maybe, but a war. And these are the weapons of choice that they use. I think what I always try to cut through in these conversations that we have, I try to cut through the noise of the violence and sort of the propaganda efforts by an organization like the Taliban. They definitely want the world to think that they are peacemakers and people who are open to Western values and to a society that would allow women to be educated at the highest level and to be treated as equals in society. But it's very important to push back against those comments when they make them, because they will say things like, absolutely, women will have access to secondary education. But we saw with our own eyes on the ground in Kabul, women being blocked from entering Kabul University, for example. You saw it in the streets. There were very few women, and those women who were able to walk freely and operate had to at least have a hijab on, if not an entire burqa. So it is one thing to listen to what the Taliban says, and it's a different thing to observe their actions.
It is just, it's heartbreaking to me thinking about, especially, well, all women in Afghanistan and girls in Afghanistan, but I'm thinking about the young people who've known nothing but the American occupation and who've known the gains that have been made over the last 20 years without the Taliban in power. More women's rights, more education, more freedom. And then, of course, the women who had it before, maybe older women who lost it and then had it back. And now it's back to the bad old days as far as they're concerned. What's your feeling about the women now, the girls there now?
Yeah, I think it's a slippery slope right now for women in Afghanistan, because very slowly but surely the Taliban will implement their tribal interpretation of Sharia law. And their version of Islam is not the version of Islam that we see all around the world, practiced by nearly 2 billion Muslims. It is a very specific and extreme version of Islam. And within that framework, the Taliban uses their views to restrict the rights of women. So I think Afghan women are extremely afraid. The ones that we spoke with in places like a beauty salon, where we actually went in and spoke with women who previously lived free in Afghanistan. They were able to walk around without covering their hair and talk about their dreams and aspirations as equal members of society. And that's just simply not the case anymore. And I think back to the conversations we had with women who just fled Afghanistan. We talked to a group of university students in Qatar, and they had just exited an evacuation flight, making it safely out of the now Taliban-controlled country. And they were so concerned about their degrees and their families and things that university women around the world would be concerned about. But yet they're worried they'll never be able to go back to the place that is home. And I think that on a very basic level, there are major fears about what comes next for Afghan women, because there's very little the international community can do when it comes to the Taliban. The sanctions are already in place. The international pressure is already there. But there are millions of Afghan women who will not have as bright a future as they were projected to have now that the Taliban is in control.
The defense by President Biden and others who advocated leaving the country was that, look, we could have done this tomorrow, in a year, in 10 years, in 20 years. It wouldn't have mattered. So why spend more American blood and treasure on this? Is that fair?
The question that was asked throughout our coverage, we spent more than 45 days in Afghanistan, Qatar, and Pakistan in total reporting on this story. And the question that was asked over and over again, should the United States have left Afghanistan? And I think in most conversations and most officials that we talked to and civilians who were experiencing this firsthand, the question always shifted from should the Americans have left Afghanistan to why and how did they leave in the manner that they did.
Okay.
So it wasn't a question always of if the Americans should have left. It was a question of how.
Yeah.
And I think it's objectively clear that the way American forces left the country was not the best possible choice. And we see all these reports coming out now that the Taliban was willing to cut some sort of deal with the Americans to allow U.S. forces to do security in Kabul as these evacuations started. And there were options still on the ground, and these are options that will be debated, and you will hear lawmakers and military officials for weeks, months, and years to come talk about this. But there were things that the U.S. could have done to make this a much smoother and safer process.
I want to talk about your training, your life, people who might want to know how this all works. You've been doing this for a long time for a pretty young guy. Talk about hostile territory training, if they still call it that, and things, just food, places to sleep.
Yeah, it's a question we actually get a lot. People say, what did you eat? Where did you stay? And it changes based on the story. In this particular story, we stayed at a hotel in Kabul. And it's a hotel where many foreign journalists stay, but the Taliban was in control of the hotel even. So they did security for the hotel while we were there. And one interesting sort of piece of this story, the unit that these fighters came from was a suicide bomb unit. So most of the guys running security at our hotel had signed up to be suicide bombers, or they were roadside bomb makers. And now they were the people that you literally saw in line at the breakfast buffet.
Wow. So yeah, the people,
the lobby.
people that would have happily seen you dead a year ago are now their job is to keep an eye on you.
Yeah, and I mean, they were very open about that too. They said, we would have killed you just months ago. And you talk to these fighters, and there were similar stories across the city. I mean, even at the airport, I remember there was one time where we were sitting waiting to meet with a top intelligence official at the airport to get access to these pieces of American military equipment left behind. And we were sitting with these fighters for hours in this room and just talking to them. And they're a similar age to me. I'm in their 20s, basically talking about their life experience. And they were talking about making bombs and how they were disappointed that they weren't chosen to be suicide bombers. And they were very open about the fact that they would have simply killed an American had they been in the same room this year, earlier in the year. So I think that it's a similar situation across Afghanistan now. There are Taliban fighters in control of the country. And when you talk about the security situation, I think it's something we calculate wherever we go. You know, we are covering conflict zones around the world, whether it be in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza, and we face similar but changing threats. You always are dealing with humans and emotions. And I think that you always have to keep that in mind when you're talking to extremists, to militants, to civilians, to anyone, that people sometimes make rash decisions very quickly. They make decisions based on emotion. You can be sitting in a room with someone and suddenly they have a memory of something the Americans did to one of their family members, and they could take that out on you. And you have to keep that in mind. So everywhere you move, even in Afghanistan, I mean, you're facing threats from not just an extreme Taliban faction, but groups like ISIS, other extremist organizations that may want to target Westerners. And you have to basically be calculating all the time. You have to be totally tuned in and focused every single day, because one wrong move could cost you your life. And you have to remember why you're there, because it can be very easy to get consumed by the story, especially when you see things that are really sometimes the most traumatic events in someone's life. You see a parent lose a child. You see people searching for their loved ones, and you know the fate of these loved ones. You see malnourished children, and these scenes and images certainly have an impact on your mental health and your ability to cover a story. But that's part of our role as foreign correspondents, to go to the places that other people won't go and tell those stories that otherwise wouldn't be told.
Trey Yingst, Fox News foreign correspondent and host of the Fox News Rundown Evening Edition. Trey, it was really good to talk to you. Welcome home. I hope you have a nice day before you head back overseas.
Thanks.
This is Mollie Hemingway with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
Even if you're not looking for real estate right now, you may have heard the market's on fire. The Case-Shiller Home Price Index increased nearly 20% in July, a fourth consecutive month of record growth, and the highest annual rate of price growth since the index began in the late 80s. In August, housing starts increased by nearly 4%.
This is a supply and demand issue.
National Home Builder Association CEO Jerry Howard recently told Fox's Neil Cavuto.
There are 40% fewer new homes on the market this year than last year. And with the organic demand that's out there, it's still very, very strong. We've got some real price pressures.
And while September marked a high point for inventory this year, supply is still on the slim side. Prices are so high it may be keeping some people from moving, and instead they're renovating. Proof is in the numbers. Home improvement finance company Hearth reported last month that home repairs increased 82% over the last 2 years, with large increases in spending on house painting, plumbers, HVAC, and electricians. Tension over whether to buy a new home or renovate an existing one is at the heart of the HGTV show Love It or List It.
Lisa's had enough.
I don't want to live in a construction zone.
And Josh is just getting started.
I fell in love with all the possibilities. I love a fun project.
Somebody's going to love it. It's just not going to be me.
David Visentin's a realtor and co-host of Love It or List It. He says these real estate prices, demand, and renovation increases all happened during the pandemic.
For one thing, the market just went bonkers.
A new season of the show is now airing on HGTV.
And buying, selling is easy, buying is hard. I mean, that's that's one of the key things that happened. I mean, the market was reasonably good prior to COVID, and then shockingly, just got crazy after COVID. I still really don't realize, why. COVID affected the market the way that it did. It made absolutely no sense, but it did. And what you have seen is, over the course of COVID, people have been sort of using their homes very differently, in a way that they never did. All of a sudden, people were like, creating spots for an office space. Or they were creating entertainment areas, with big screen TVs because they weren't going to theaters. There was now a school zone area, so kids could be on Zoom school and work from there. So all of a sudden, that kind of starts to, affect people's ideas in terms of renovations that they should do, not just for their families, but also to add value in terms of what, they think buyers might be looking for. In this current, market and, the way life is currently.
Do you think these pandemic-related changes will last?
I think there's a couple that will. I think people are going to go out to restaurants, and I think people are going to still do that. I haven't been to a movie theater yet, still. And I don't even know if I will. So I think the home theaters that people are putting in will still resonate for people. I think that's something that's not going away, even though people were watching TV and they were watching movies. But now you go into, a lot of homes and people have got like these theater rooms that are incredible. And they were like, few and far between before COVID, the occasional you'd walk into a house and it'd be like, oh my God, they have a home theater in here. But now it's kind of like, almost like everybody does,
right.
Everybody's turning their basements into like these entertainment centers, where they can get together with their family and sit down and eat popcorn, and watch a major feature, on their, 80-inch TV. And I also don't, the home offices, I think that's going to continue because I think there's a good section of people that might not go back to offices. And there's corporations out there that I think have seen what can be done without office spaces that they have to pay for. And so a lot of those are going to continue. So I think having a home office is going to be something also that, that sticks.
You're the listed guy on the show, right? You're the one pushing for, like, let's put this up for sale. Did you find that more and more people wanted to love it, wanted to renovate?
Well, it's funny, because we kind of, although we did a bit of shooting through COVID, we were down for a lot of it because we couldn't film. The film industry did get shut down. So I don't know that it affected the numbers at all. I think people still need to have homes that work for them and that they love. Right. And if it's time to move, it's time to move. And if, and if it's not, it's not. But people are always going to be so attached to their homes, especially if they've been in them, in them for 10 or 15 years. You don't need COVID to make somebody, want to love it, even though the house I showed them makes more sense. Got it. But that does affect it a little bit, but I don't think very much. Not really.
I know you guys focused the show for several seasons in North Carolina, but I imagine you pay attention to the real estate market everywhere. And you even referenced earlier in our own interview that you saw the real estate market sort of catch fire during the pandemic. Is it on fire everywhere? Is it going to stay on fire? I have this theory, right, that when people really do go back to work, maybe in 2022, that the housing market might cool down a bit. Am I wrong?
I would say that it kind of depends on, where you live. Certain cities are just always going to be hot. And, even within a city, there's these little micro markets that never seem to be not hot. I don't think it's going to dial back, all that much. I think people are always going to want housing. It's just, I don't see it changing. What I am seeing right now, though, is in the major cities, if you go to the outskirts, it's not as hot as it was. It's already kind of taking a little bit of a slower approach. Not that things aren't selling. It's just there's not the multiple offer situations everywhere that there was. So I do think you're going to see a dial back in certain neighborhoods and certain areas once people are all back at work in 2022. But I think major cities like Toronto, New York, all of those ones, it's not going to slow down.
I was reading rental prices in New York and Manhattan in particular have skyrocketed. Tell me, renovations, depending on how involved they are, can cost quite a bit. And forget building a new house from scratch. That costs a lot as well. You need supplies. Yep. And we've been hearing about, supply chain shortages. We've heard about sawmill production, being scaled back because of COVID. And then when it started to ramp back up again, there was like this backlog. Lumber prices went up. What have you seen or heard about the supply chain issue affecting real estate and even renovations?
Well, getting stuff is really the tough part. Everything, getting wood, getting appliances, and getting parts for stuff is next to impossible. I was building a, I have a hot tub in my backyard, and I was building this kind of trellis over the top of it to give me a little bit of shade. And so the guy who was doing it for me was like, David, I just priced out the wood. If you'd have done it last year, it would have cost you 10 times less. Do you still want to do it? The price of wood just went up so dramatically, and it's it's not price gouging, it's demand. It's just there wasn't enough. More people wanted it than there was supply, and that just happened. And it's dialing back now. It's kind of coming back down to earth, but it's made it tough. It's made it tough for renovations. It's made it tough for shows trying to get stuff. It's definitely it's been a huge issue.
Let's talk about the future. You talked about adding value to your home. What is the best way in your mind to do that, regardless of pandemic or not? Like I've heard, for example, like with aging baby boomers, adding an addition or guest house for your parent might be a good idea. Is that realistic? What are some of the things you think of when you think of a high value home in this day and age?
If you're building any kind of an in-law suite where your parents are going to live, the value is there. I mean, it's invaluable. I mean, it's just you can't even put a price on it. Now, when you go to sell it, is there demand for in-law suites where you live? Are you doing something that's out of the norm in that neighborhood? And that's really, I think, what you've got to look at when you're doing anything beyond the obvious renovation to the kitchen and the bathrooms that everybody knows will add value. If you've got the space and you're adding another, an addition of 1,000 square feet, does your neighborhood allow for that? And what you're putting in, will you get it back out again? So you really kind of have to look at where you are and what your neighborhood will allow for. What's the ceiling in your neighborhood currently? If you hold on to it for 10 or 15 years, then obviously that ceiling is much higher. But if you're talking about an immediate turnaround, you kind of really have to know. And that's why I always tell people, whenever they're going beyond sort of renovating a kitchen or renovating a bathroom or adding a bathroom, when you're talking about adding 1,500 square feet to your house, or adding a two-car garage, or putting in a lap pool, look around at your neighborhood and see what stuff is selling for, and see what people are offering and whether it's feasible, because you can't overdo your house in a neighborhood.
David Visentin, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
New from the Fox News Podcasts Network.
My name is Kennedy, and welcome to my podcast, which will, I humbly say, single-handedly save the world. You're welcome.
It's Kennedy Saves the World. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
And now, some good news with Tonya J. Powers.
Today marks 70 years since I Love Lucy first hit TV screens in American households. It premiered on October 15th, 1951, and became the first series to air in 10 million homes. 6 months after its debut, it was the #1 show in America. Since then, it's aired in 77 different countries, been translated into multiple languages, and was named one of TV Guide's best series of all time. Its fans have endured throughout the decades, and many have even traveled to the Lucille Ball Desi Arnaz Museum, which is located in Jamestown, New York. Visitors can see replica sets of Lucy and Ricky Ricardo's New York City apartment, as well as their California suite at the fictional Beverly Palms Hotel, in addition to seeing scripts, wardrobes, and props on display. If you're planning a road trip there, add in some extra time to see the National Comedy Center, which is near the museum and has exhibits with artifacts from some of the most well-loved comedians like Jerry Seinfeld and Carol Burnett. Journey Gunderson, the executive director of the museum and the center, told Fox News, quote, "What we see in both museums every day are visitors leaving and saying, 'I never expected to laugh for 4 hours straight.' And who doesn't need that?" Tonya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
I'm Mollie Hemingway.
What's on your mind?
From 2016 through 2020, the easiest way to achieve stardom on the political left was to loudly proclaim one's belief that the 2016 election was illegitimate, stolen by the Russians on behalf of a corrupt traitor. Conspiracy mongering up to and including the assertion that the President of the United States was a secret Russian spy was the highest form of patriotism. And then 2020 happened. At the drop of a hat, America's electoral system went from irredeemably corrupt and broken in 2016 to unquestionably safe in 2020. Voting methods that were allegedly used to steal elections in 2004 and 2016 suddenly became sacrosanct and unquestionable in 2020. Whereas so-called election experts repeatedly warned pre-2020 about the pitfalls of electronic voting and widespread mail-in balloting, by November 2020, any discussion about the vulnerabilities of those methods was written off as the stuff of right-wing cranks and conspiracy mongers. Such dismissals required ignoring quite real problems with election integrity affecting hundreds of U.S. elections at the state and local levels, and even the 1960 presidential election, when John F. Kennedy won just 118,574 more votes than Richard Nixon. That Electoral College win hinged on victories in Illinois, where Chicago vote totals were suspiciously high for Kennedy, and Texas, a state where Kennedy's running mate Lyndon B. Johnson had been known to exert control over election results. Official biographers and historians have claimed one or both states would have been won by Nixon in a fair election. If concerns about election integrity were valid from at least 1960 through 2016, then surely those concerns were even more valid in 2020, an election year unlike any other in American history. In the lead up to the election, Thanks in part to the coronavirus pandemic that gripped the world, wide-ranging electoral reforms were implemented. Many changes, allegedly justified by the global pandemic, were broad reforms that Democrats had long desired. The crisis was their chance to sneak in contentious policies through the back door. The bedrock of the American Republic is that elections must be free, fair, accurate, and trusted. Election lawyers will tell you that fraud is almost impossible to conclusively find after the fact, and that to fight it, strong rules and regulations are needed on the front end. That's why Democrats and Republicans fight so bitterly about the rules and regulations that govern the process. What happened during the 2020 election must be investigated and discussed, not in spite of media and political opposition to an open inquiry, but because of that opposition. The American people deserve to know what happened. They deserve answers, even if those answers are inconvenient. They deserve to know the effect flooding the system with tens of millions of mail-in ballots had on their vote. They deserve to know how and why big tech and the corporate political media manipulated the news to support certain political narratives while censoring stories they now admit were true. They deserve to know why courts were allowed to unilaterally rewrite the rules in the middle of the contest, often without the consent of the legislative bodies charged with writing election laws. This has been an excerpt from Rigged: How the Media, Big Tech, and the Democrats Seized Our Elections. I'm Mollie Hemingway.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network, subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and four-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.